Hello, YouTube. Welcome back. Getting ready to head out to work. I'm actually in the car. Hospital is behind me. One thing I did want to talk about was, especially today, there are a lot of what they refer to as red pill coaches or the game coaches teaching you how to talk to women. And in our day, women don't need men because we live in the good times, right? And the good times create weak men. And that's why many women are not attracted to most men, because most men are weak and there is an abundance of men, which means that your value has already been diminished. Just being a man by itself, your value is diminished. You have to create value just by being a man, whereas women are born with their value. And since there are an overwhelming plethora of men nowadays, because there hasn't been any sort of real war where men have lost their value. That's why you had the baby boom, right? Because there were fewer men and the women needed the men. And so we had a baby boom because the women were so in need of men that the social contract remained intact. And then as time went on, a generation or two, and then you see the outcome. We are living in the good times that were created by the strong men that came before us. And so you see a lot of people are talking about, red pilling people. And the cycle is not that the weak men become strong. It's that they get culled. In our day, there's no, what do they say? There's no consequence for being weak. Yes, financially, but even still, you can eke out a solid living, if you're making 40 or 50,000. But that's not the sort of hard times that we're talking about. It's typically overwhelmingly it's related to war and what causes scarcity of men. And it's living in those times where the weak men get called because the price for weakness is death. And that's why you see, so many of these people talking about I'm trans this and I'm, and overwhelmingly it's typically white men, because overwhelmingly white men have grown weak because of the good times, because the good times have made white men weak. And they've lost control of their women. And you see it from the early 1900s by giving their women the right to vote, which of course was just the introduction of communism, but they should have been smart enough and strong enough to say no. And there are multiple stages where the men should have been stronger. And what was the result of that? Right? Women and children are the spoils of war. And so most women marry the government nowadays. And the war between men and governments, which when you read the Declaration of Independence, overwhelmingly it's talking about the men that are responsible for overturning the government when the government becomes too strong and it no longer represents the people. It says that it is the responsibility of the people. Obviously they're speaking to men who are the ones that are going to go to war to rectify the situation. And so you get a lot of these red pill or dating coaches or masculine alpha men, etc. And they always talk about earning money. But that's not what creates strong men. It is, especially in our day, it is what is going on between men and the government, from the divorce laws to child losing. Most men lose custody of their children. And this is the problem. And so what they teach you is well, maybe you didn't earn enough. And it's like, well, look at many of these very wealthy movie stars, like Brad Pitts of the world. They too get divorce graped for their money as well. And it's at the whim of the state, because nobody wants to push back against the state, because the times are so good that you're just like, fuck it. They'll take half. I'll have half. I'll still be okay. It's not worth losing my life. But when you look at the founding fathers, overwhelmingly the founding fathers were young men. They were young men who reached their limit. When you read the Declaration of Independence, when you read the part where they talk about that they perceive that God created all men equal. There is a laundry list that they name of what they tried to do to appease King George during those time periods. And it took 3 years for those men to finally realize, fuck it. It took them years of trying to negotiate and appease King George at that time, who was basically overreaching, and they got tired of him. They wanted to come here and they wanted to start a new way of life. And so it wasn't just they instituted some T-tax and they were like, we ain't paying you a T-tax, and they just shouldered their rifle. No, it took them years to reach the stage of where they said, fuck it, we're going to war. And they had to force men to go to war. And in nowadays, you have way too many weak people. I mean, you just look at the fattest generation right now are millennials. It's like 70, I think it's like 76% of millennial men are overweight, bordering obese. And these individuals are not going to become red pilled. There's not going to be this awakening among the masses of men. It's not going to happen. What happens is that the times, as a result of the weak men, become hard. The times become hard. And the consequence for weakness during those time periods is death. And so that's what causes the men during that time period to become strong. They are forced to become strong because the weak get culled, and then the patriarchy returns. Because it's under that situation where you have male scarcity, and then the women return to their natural gender role. You saw it in Afghanistan, right? Just look at a perfect example is what happened in Afghanistan, where the men pushed out the American soldiers, holding off for 20 years. 20 years they fought back against American military. It just goes to show you how weak the American military is. For people who are afraid of the government, for people who are afraid of the American military, I don't want the military or the police knocking on my door, you're so afraid. It just goes to show how weak they are, that for 20 years they were held back by the Taliban. For 20 years. Think about that. Imagine you were living in your country and you were being occupied. Would you have the testicular fortitude to fight for all that time? And what were the men fighting for? They were fighting for their culture, they were fighting for their land, and they were fighting for their women, and they were fighting for their children. And so what did America do during that time period? They introduced feminism into Afghanistan, into the culture, because they weren't strong enough to overtake the men. They weren't strong enough to overtake the men, to defeat them. So they had to go for the women and indoctrinate the women into accepting feminism. And finally, when the men were able to push them out, there were no women that shouldered their rifle, right? There was no women that were going to go to war. We're going to go to war for our freedom and none of that. They just went right back to their natural gender, right? As they say, they went right back to the kitchen, right back to having children. And eventually, this too will happen in America because it's just natural. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. And we've been living in the strong. So it's funny listening to the baby boomers. You know, a lot of the baby boomers talk so much shit about the generations that came after them when they lived at the epitome of wealth. In fact, most baby boomer generations were the ones who voted for the expansion of wealth, for the expansion of the dollar. They voted for welfare programs. They voted for Social Security. They voted for Medicare and for Medicaid, and etc. They literally sacrificed their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren so that they could live a wealthy lifestyle. And yet we now are living at the time period where we are now at the tail end of all those decisions that they made. And there is no more money left. There is no more money left. And that's why I say that the welfare state is what will collapse America. Just look at Argentina going through the same thing. Turkey, Venezuela, Cuba. Look at Europe. Europe is on the verge of a collapse. And what are they doing? They're printing more money because the moment the people even feel a little bit of pain, they run to the government. Save us, government, save us. You got to do something. These prices, they're too high. Instead of telling the people, get to work. You need to work more. You need to work to sustain the level that you want to live, the standard of life that you want to live. You got to work harder. No politician can say that. Just look at America. America is a perfect example. You have all these weak people, morbidly obese. 10% of American population is obese. 10% of Americans are diabetic. And instead of just telling these people to get off their ass, lose weight, people are coming to the hospital 300 plus pounds on a regular basis, and they rotate in and out like a revolving door. They don't pay a single penny. It all gets thrown onto the backs of their children and their grandchildren, who are forced to pay it via taxation and losing a standard of life. But people thinking that we're gonna, you're gonna red pill all these men, and you have all the Andrew Tates of the world thinking that they're just gonna interject all of this information and just put it out into the ether, and people are gonna accept it, and the men are gonna turn around and they're gonna rally. It's not gonna happen. It's never happened like that way in history. It is the hard times that create strong men, like a diamond. It takes time and pressure to bring about value. And that's what, for many of us, I don't even know if I'll live to see. I'll probably live through the hard times. Who knows if I'll make it? Because the hard times are coming. It is just a cycle. Just like, we have summer, you have spring, you have autumn, you have winter. Winter is coming. That's why America is pushing so hard what's going on in Ukraine. Because weakness invites violence. And so America looking weak against Russia makes the other nations start to think, well, maybe fuck your sanctions. Like Russia did. America sanctioned the shit out of Russia, and Russia is doing better. Europe is eating shit right now because of the sanctions. And it's only going to get worse come this winter. And it'll get worse for here in America. But the Europeans are fucked. The Europeans are fucked. They completely fucked themselves. And it was their own fault. Because they, as a whole, the cathedral refuses to take the L and move on. That's why they push so hard against Russia. Because if they lose, it's over. If America loses the proxy war that is going on, it is over. It is over for America. And in the future, countries will be like, we don't need the dollar. We don't need to worry about America. We can ally with Russia. We can ally with places like China. It will embolden other nations to be like, we're not afraid of you anymore. There's nothing to be fearful of. Just Russia was the example. Look what happened with the Taliban. The Taliban emboldened. Weakness always invites violence. And America hasn't won a war in a very long time. Just look what happened when America tried to go to war in Vietnam. They got pushed back by fucking rice farmers. And look what happened with the Taliban. It's not like these people had up-to-date tech and advanced military and Marines and all this technology. They didn't. They had old-school weapons that they fought the Russians back in, what was it, the 1970s? They were fighting these people, but they were strong men because of the hard times in their nation. It was because of the hard times in Afghanistan that weak men get culled, and all you have are strong men. And that's why they couldn't break them. And that's why the men kept pushing. Why didn't they just give up and accept the money? They had nothing to do with the money. They didn't want the money. It had to do with who they were as strong men. They refused. They refused to give up. For 20 years, think about that. For 20 years, these men fought off an advanced military with a navy, with an air force, advanced military, and advanced technology. For 20 years, they pushed back against them. That is what the hard times create. It creates strong men like that. In America, you have the men are waiting for the collapse. They're hoping for the collapse. You have all these white liberals out here waiting for the country to burn down. And you have other people on the flip side that see America going to shit and they're like, fuck it, let it burn. People aren't looking to fight, especially not for Joe Biden, not for this administration. But in Afghanistan, these people were willing to fight over the sand because it was their home. And the men were willing to fight for their women. Are there men nowadays in America that are going to fight for the American women? Hells no. It's not going to happen. It is what it is. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching, and I'll check you next time.